You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
Welcome again. My name is Marv Bergman. I work here at the State Historical Society as the editor of the Annals of Iowa, our scholarly journal. This is the second of our programs in which we've cooperated with the University of Iowa Press for programs based on books that are just brand new off their press, and we're excited about and pleased to be cooperating with them. Also want to thank the City Channel, Channel 4, which is taping this program as they've taped others for broadcast at some point in the future. Our guest today is Thomas Baker. Tom is Associate Dean of Students at the University of Iowa. He earned his BA, his law degree, and a Master of Arts in History, all at the University of Iowa. He's been a judicial administrator since 1988, specializing in civil rights investigations, and he does historical research in his spare time. And he is, of course, the product of that research in his spare time is this book, Sacred Cause of Union, Iowa and the Civil War, just out from the University of Iowa Press. And that will be the basis for his talk today. I know that this is a long time labor of love for Tom. Not long after I started working here, almost 30 years ago, I talked to Mac Rohrbaugh, asked him if he had any students who were doing work that I should know about that I might pursue for publication in the Annals of Iowa. And he said, well, I've got this former student who's doing some really interesting work. You should talk to him. And so I emailed Tom, I think. I don't know, we had email back in those days, but somehow I got in touch with Tom, and we had lunch. And we had lunch about every 5 years since then, I think, just to catch up on where he was with that project. It's been very interesting to learn about that project. So it's been a long time labor of love. Sometimes that's a condescending term. I don't mean it at all that way. It's a work of first-rate scholarship as well. And but it's amateur in the best sense of the word. He's doing it for the love of it. He's not going to make big money. I hope that's not a disappointment to hear that just now. But and it's not going to get him a promotion in his work either, but it is valuable work that he's doing and something that he loves. And I hope you welcome Tom Baker.
Thank you, Marvin. Thanks for all of you for coming on a cold and windy day. I picked this topic about single state histories in a way to challenge myself, because I think that single state works are suspect for reasons that I'll explain here. One way to think about the historiography here, and one way to assess the potential of one state research designs is to go back 50 years. So if we go back to 1965 and compare that to 2016, question is, what do we know today about the Civil War that we did not know in 1965? The answer is quite a bit more. And that's because it was only after the 100th anniversary that historians began to apply social approaches to the study of history. And this social approach to research has improved considerably our understanding of the war's causes and events. So if we think about 50 years ago, 1965, most of the books on the shelf would have been written about military campaigns. There were many books that specifically focused on individual Iowa regiments. There were a number of excellent biographies of politicians. The World War I era, 1917, 1918, produced some excellent journal articles. And in the 1950s, in anticipation of the 100th anniversary, Mildred Throne produced, I would guess, 4 dozen articles about the Civil War. Mildred was going through all the boxes, I think, in this building and in Des Moines, trying to find old journals and diaries and things like that. There was no statewide analysis done, though, of Iowa to celebrate the 100th anniversary. In the last 50 years, there's a number of excellent works that were produced, and I think a lot of the new social research approach rubbed off on these authors. Robert Cook has produced a book on the Iowa Republican Party. Bob Dykstra produced an excellent book about race relations in frontier Iowa. Hubert Wubbin produced a book about the Democratic Party called The Copperheads in Iowa. Russ Johnson, one of our PhD students, produced a book on Dubuque. Steve Meyer produced a mammoth book on Iowa's military courage. Then there's been a multitude of books written by other people outside of the state of Iowa involving battles that involved Iowa troops. There's also been a number of ethnic studies published about ethnic groups in Iowa during the Civil War. Most of those have been in the form of journal articles. There's a number of books and articles about women during the Civil War. Most of the books on Iowa tend to focus on Annie Wittenmeyer. I was really pleased that with this is what I call the post-Ken Burns avalanche of books. And a number of people went to great trouble to publish diaries or letters, and there were at least 2 books published about Iowa soldiers, this is in the last 20 years, in which there was a bilateral exchange of information, not simply letters home from the soldier, but also responses back from the family, in particular the wives. And I used several of those in my book. There's also been a great improvement in the amount of material on African Americans in Iowa. Some PhD dissertations, several journal articles, and much of the credit for this goes to Marv at the Annals. I would guess there's at least a dozen, maybe 24 articles that have been published in the last 30 years about Iowa's role in the Civil War. So there was not an attempt to publish a book on the state as a whole. And when I attempted to do this, I had the luxury of having a lot of these resources, primary materials in part. What I added to the mix was 6 things. I wanted to include information about individual families, so I used the agriculture census data. I also used real estate records. And the records were records about property being purchased and sold were especially helpful to study the impact of the 1857 panic. I determined the enlistment rates by county. That had never been done before. And also looked at election results from county to county to see differences and similarities. I was able to do an ethnic analysis of Iowa's regiments. In other words, what the demographic profile of the troops was in terms of nativity. And also, I studied battlefield performance primarily by reading the many excellent military history books that were produced, that have been produced since the Ken Burns Civil War show was I think 1990 was the first year that was shared. Now, there's other examples on this slide here. If you're not aware of it, there are some excellent books out on the New York City, St. Louis. This is Russ Johnson's book on Dubuque. And the Knoxville, Tennessee book, published in 2009. If you haven't read the Knoxville, Tennessee book, get it. It's the best book I've ever read. There's also been interesting books studying rural areas. This is, again, within the last 10 years. Jones County, Mississippi is a great book if you haven't read that. There's excellent book on rural areas in Indiana, and their experience during the Civil War, experience in Pennsylvania in the coal mining areas, book on Cedar Falls by an Iowan, and a recent book on the North Carolina Low Country. I also mentioned earlier that there's been some books where authors would study a single topic within a single state. Those are books like Robert Cook's book, Bob Dykstra's book, Hubert Wubbin's book. I could only find 4 other books written in the last 10 years that involved the study of individual states. So I'm going to try my best to describe and compare these 5 different books. The basic trend seems to me that publishers are attempting to bridge the gap between traditional popular war history and modern social research. And I will certainly credit the U of I Press for seeing the value of including more than just politics and military history in books like this. What I was looking for was to see to what extent there's a balance in these books here between military history and social history. I think there's an attempt to include a balance, but not all succeed. I'll talk about that later. It seems like we're still struggling to find a formula that appeals to a general audience of readers and one that also contributes to our historiography for researchers. Why do books that were published 60 or 70 years ago, why do they focus so much on military history? The answer, I think, is the consensus building. The further away we get from the event, people are trying to sell books to a wide audience, and the nuances get avoided, in part because of a desire to sell books and a desire to promote current pride, I guess I would say. Several of the books on Iowa have included personal biographies, and I assume that these personal biographies were included as a way to cover the cost of publication, and that, I think, tends to work at cross purposes to objectivity. So the challenge for me was, can I write a book that somebody wants to publish that also contributes to the larger national historiography? What happens if we examine gender, race, ethnicity, and nativity in addition to politics through the eyes of ordinary men and women, black and white? And here are my basic conclusion was that when you add all these elements together, that the diversity becomes very obvious. The war experience takes on another dimension, I think. It's, at least for me, it's exciting to see how developments in one state affect the national situation and how Iowans contributed to the outcome of the Civil War. These social interactions that are revealed challenge our traditional notions of consensus and our traditional notions of common experience. It also, this is what surprised me, is that we learn a lot more about our military units by looking at Iowa history through a social lens than we have traditionally. Even though we've got dozens, maybe hundreds of books about Iowa military units, there's rarely any information in those books about the background, the demography of those units. Okay, I'm skipping through a few slides to make sure I get done on time. Okay, so before we talk about Iowa's role in the war, let's look first of all and consider the demographic demographic profile of the state in 1861. We all know that Iowa was a state that officially prohibited slavery. We also know that this was the first free state west of the Mississippi River. We also know that this was a state of migrants. And it's important to think about this, that when we think about migrants today, we usually think about people born in another country. But in fact, everyone, virtually every adult in the state of Iowa in 1861 had been born somewhere else, whether it was Kentucky or Indiana or New York or Germany or England or France. They were not born in Iowa. It's also important to keep in mind that Iowans were high-risk takers by and large. The people who ventured to the frontier assumed a number of risks. So when we think about how that psychology affects enlistment, battlefield performance, and things like that, it's pretty important. Economically, Iowa was a state of family farmers. Many of them were subsistence farmers, very different than it is today and very different than it was in 1900. We had some urban laborers, but not very many, and the coal mining explosion in Iowa did not happen until after the Civil War. So unlike other states, we had no concentrations of coal miners for the recruiters to go after, and we had no logging companies for the most part. They were hardwood trees in Iowa, not softwood trees. So compared to eastern states, and I'm talking here about the Northeast, Iowa's cities were small and its population was spread fairly evenly across the landscape, at least in eastern Iowa. Most of our farming operations were primitive. So in other words, the point here is that they had to spend much of their time converting the wilderness before they could even plant crops or improve the size of their herds. This skill set, I'll call it, is something to think about when you're talking about how these frontier farmers, how they're going to be able to perform in terms of marching, in terms of their battle readiness. It's a different skill set than we get from other states. Our state's merchants, meanwhile, were deeply in debt as a result of the 1857 credit crisis. Many of them were still at risk of bankruptcy when 1861 rolled around. And it was interesting to me, I found no individual Iowan who had purchased Southern bonds prior to 1861. These were the bonds that states sold, states like Mississippi and Alabama. They sold the bonds at 6% interest or 7% interest. And Northerners from many states purchased these bonds. I found out that from reading the Wisconsin book that the state bank in Wisconsin had purchased quite a number of Southern bonds. I'm sure there were some wealthy Iowans who purchased Southern bonds, but they're hard to find. If anybody knows about this, let me know, because it's quite fascinating. Okay, so compared to nearby states, we had unfortunately very small number of African Americans, less than 1% of our population in 1860. White abolitionists were also few and far between compared to other states. We did have a Native American population, but again, that's a fairly small group, number-wise, located in just one county. Now, I compared Iowa with Wisconsin, and many of you know Wisconsin was probably the most, the state with the highest proportion of European natives. So I knew that Iowa did not have as many European natives as Wisconsin. If you define Europeans as being the parents born in Europe or the children of parents born in Europe, it makes up about 1/3 of Iowa's population. Wisconsin was more than 50% of European nativity. Now, even though we had a smaller portion of European natives, we did have a similar profile to states like Wisconsin. German-speaking people were living in Iowa in 1861, some Scandinavian. The most common was British Isles, and the British Isles, of course, included a number of different ethnic groups: Catholic Irish, Protestant Irish, Scottish, some Welsh, and some from England. I want to talk a little bit about the profile of U.S.-born Iowans. So roughly 2/3 of Iowa families came from another state in North America. A majority had previously lived in an Ohio River Valley state. By that I mean lived in Kentucky, Western Virginia, Southern Ohio, Southern Indiana, or Southern Illinois. And these people, if you look at not that map, but the map of North America, they had to ride a considerable distance north to get to Iowa. If they had driven their wagons directly west, they would have wound up in Missouri. So it didn't happen by accident that they wound up in Iowa. They deliberately chose Iowa and crossed the Mississippi River somewhere north of Keokuk. Now, of course, in addition to the slave state natives, you've got a large number of families that have roots in New England or New York or Pennsylvania. What I found when you set this out geographically is that slave state natives tended to self-segregate from northeastern natives. Or maybe you could say it the other way around. Northeastern natives self-segregated from slave state natives. I'm not sure what the cause and effect is, but so when you think about Iowa as a state, there's a potential for a lot of internal dissent, whether it's the slave state natives living in southern Iowa or whether it's the New England natives living in northern Iowa. But as you go from the Missouri border to the Minnesota border and you calculate the percentage of New England natives and the percentage of Kentucky natives, it's an inverse relationship. Very few Kentucky natives chose to live near Minnesota, where there's lots of New England families there. And then as you get closer to Missouri, you have very few New England families. So that piqued my curiosity. Now, another thing to think about in terms of population numbers, if you talk about the Louisiana Purchase, this is going to surprise you, I think. 70% of Free State residents in the Louisiana Purchase lived in Iowa. Now, there were 4 free states: Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota. But again, Iowa was the one that had by far the highest population. The other states were just getting settled. Minnesota's population was about 170,000, about 1/4 the size of Iowa. When you look at the slave states, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and if you throw in Texas, there's 4 times as many people in the slave states when you count slaves. If you take the slaves out of the calculation, it's still 3-to-1 ratio. So think about this in terms of the military theater of operations in the Trans-Mississippi. You're going to find Union troops generally are going to be outnumbered in most of the battles because there were so many more whites that lived south of Iowa. Okay, so here's a quick summary of the conclusions I made. How did Iowa's demography shape our Civil War experience? Number 1, the enlistment quotas generated tremendous social tension in Iowa. And there's actually 2 aspects of this. I expected there to be conflict between US-born Iowans and European-born Iowans. But there are actually also a number of neighborhoods in Iowa that also resisted the enlistment, resisted the threat of a draft, because they were, many of these communities had kin in the Upper South, but more than their kinship ties, they had a very libertarian philosophy. So the federal tax, the threat of a federal conscription set them off because of their libertarian instincts. The second point here, it's interesting to compare the soldiers that volunteered in 1862 against the 1861 recruiting class, and what you find is that the 1862 class was not only older, but it contained a higher percentage of U.S. natives than the 61 class, and it also contained a higher percentage of evangelicals. I don't have any explanation for why evangelicals enlisted at a higher rate in 1862. If there's a graduate student looking for a dissertation topic, you've got one now. The 1862 recruiting class was important because they really drove home emancipation as a war aim. And by the end of the war, if you compare the white Iowans' attitudes toward slavery and toward black civil rights, compared 1861 to 1865, Iowa, of all free states, Iowa was the state that experienced the greatest change from outly discriminating against blacks to voting in favor of black civil rights after the war. And of course, this was a direct result of the military experience of white Iowans. Most Iowa units spent the bulk of their time in the military west of the Mississippi River. A number of Iowans fought in Arkansas. Some were stationed there for almost 3 years. Arkansas was a dangerous place to be because it was the lowest on the totem pole in terms of getting logistical supplies from the Federal Army, and yet they faced enemies from Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. So most of the battles that were fought in Arkansas, the Iowans were outnumbered, and the way that they won these battles was working collectively with immigrant military units. In particular, there were a number of German-speaking units that fought alongside English-speaking units in Arkansas. There were also some of the first African-American military units fought in Arkansas, and there were also some Native Americans that were recruited to fight for the Union cause. So as a result of all of this diversity and the collective work, they were able to defeat the enemy in battle, even though they were outnumbered. If you look at diaries and letters home, it's clear that Iowans who joined the Army were not anti-Southern in their ideology. This is a big debate nationally, as you might imagine. Why did people join the Army? There's been several books that said that it was anti-Southern. Well, that may be true for New York or Pennsylvania, but it's not true for Iowa. Iowans joined the Army because they believed, most of them, that permanent disunity would usher in an era of tyranny and economic oppression. Number 6, there's a very interesting labor history aspect to Iowa's Civil War story. Men, women on the home front and on the war front undertook an immense amount of physical labor to win the war. And they tended to look at the Civil War from a labor perspective. They perceived the Union Army to be an instrument of democratic governance. This is quite different, I think, than today, where we would think of, since the Army is basically the federal Army, we don't usually think of it as an instrument of democratic governance. There's also a gender war. I'm going to be speaking in 2 days at Keokuk about Annie Wittenmeyer. There was something major that happened in Iowa that previous historians have minimized. There was a critical mass of women in charge of local ladies' aid societies that for approximately 2 years fought a political battle against male state administrators over the process of distributing food and supplies to soldiers. I don't have a whole lot of time to go into this, so I'll just say if you want to know more about the gender war, go read the book. Now, actually, this clarity here is I was a little bit worried about this. These are the 6 families that I picked for my book. And as you can see, they're spread out by region. I tried to find an ideal grouping here. Annie Wittenmeyer lived in Keokuk. She had family roots in Virginia. Alexander Clark is, of course, Iowa's foremost advocate for black civil rights. Alexander Clark was a delegate at the 1872 National Republican Convention, so he was selected by white delegates. There's still all sorts of memorials in Muscatine about Alex Clark. The family that lived near Dubuque has family roots in New York State. The Oskaloosa family, where both the father and 2 sons fought in the Army, they were carpenters from Ohio. Cyrus Carpenter, many of you know that Cyrus Carpenter was the governor of Iowa after the war. At the start of the war, Cyrus Carpenter was living in Fort Dodge, which really is at the frontier line. There are only about 2,500 people in Webster County. 2,500, not 25,000, so it was really on the edge of the frontier. The Musser family that lived in Potawatomi came to Iowa through Missouri. They, I think, originally were from Pennsylvania a few generations back, but on their way to Potawatomi County, their oldest son decided to leave the family and work in Missouri, and it turned out the oldest son wound up fighting for the Confederate Army. The second oldest son wound up fighting in the Union Army, the 29th Iowa Infantry Regiment. So, 5 books produced in the last few years on states. Is there a stigma associated with state books? There's also, I think, a potential problem I don't know that people feel loyal to their state in the same way that people did 50 years ago. So we'll see. We'll see with Allison's help, maybe we can bust that myth. So my argument here, to make a long story short, is that state histories can be very beneficial to our understanding of the war for reasons I'll explain in just a minute. I think part of the key is to resist the temptation to load up the book with lots of military information and instead focus on the process of doing good historical research. What I would say is that any historian in the early stages of their research, when they're contemplating what they want to do, when they're designing their project, I think that doing a utility analysis, to what extent are state boundaries important? And if jurisdiction is important, then look at the optimal size of a state. In other words, I don't think you want to pick the state of New York and produce a 90,000 word book. That's not going to work. So find a state that's about the right size in terms of population and geography, and start there and see if you've got the resources to do what you want to do with it. Now here's a list of popular topics today. So 21st century researchers are studying things like enlistment motivation, the role of women in the war, election trends, conflict between different ethnic groups, the politics of dissent has taken on a new life, and finally battlefield performance. Now, here are some reasons why jurisdiction is important. I think, again, we shouldn't try and separate military out from non-military aspects of the war. I think there's some cross-fertilization by studying both. The main reason that it's important to think in terms of boundary lines when you're defining the scope of your project is that what federal officials now do with military administration, most of that work was done by state officials in 1861. The federal government didn't assume control over military tasks until the 20th century. In 1861, state officials enlisted citizen soldiers, trained them, fed them while they were training, nursed them when they got sick on the war front, equipped them, appointed their officers, and grouped the volunteers into companies and regiments as they saw fit. And at least in 1861, the state had to pay the cost for functioning with that responsibility. So since the states had so much discretion, it's not surprising that different states pursued different paths in terms of the process of recruiting and complying with the federal mandates. Even after Congress enacted funding measures in 1862 and the Conscription Act that year, it was still pretty much a state-centered training process. Another reason I would suggest that state research focus is good is that it's a little bit easier in that many of the vital records that you're going to want to look for are stored today in state repositories, so you don't have to travel from county to county necessarily. It's fairly centrally located. If you're studying ethnic and cultural groups during the war, I think a state-based approach is definitely important. There's some risk if you try to study one ethnic group from New York and one ethnic group from Iowa. If they're different ethnic groups, it's going to be a little hard, I think, to produce much beneficial information. Another aspect of the states is that today, of course, except for the National Guard units, federal military units are all run through this training camp without regard to their nativity or place of residence. Iowa produced 48 regiments during the war, and nearly every one was stationed for a time in the state of Missouri. There were no Iowans fighting in the Army of the Potomac until 1864, and then that was only 3 regiments. There were no Iowans fighting in the Army of the Cumberland. So because of the geographic difference, what Iowa soldiers endured was very different than what soldiers from New York State endured, for example. Okay, so here's what you may have been looking for. This is the information about the 4 books here. The Connecticut book, can I walk away or should I stay by the microphone? Okay, I guess that means stay by the microphone. Matthew Warshauser is a community college history professor. The Wisconsin book was written by Frank Clement, and many of you will recognize him as a longtime professor at Marquette. He got his PhD at Madison, and he spent most of his professional time writing about dissent. So he was the ideal person to write the Wisconsin book, although I will tell you I suspect that Mr. Clement had many disagreements with the publishers, because when you open the book and read through the book, it doesn't have any pictures of women, doesn't talk about women's relief. It talks a little bit about ethnic group dysfunction, and I was surprised that the first draft riot that occurred in Milwaukee in 1862, 9 months before the draft riots in New York City. Iowa did not have any draft riots. The Minnesota book, if you're curious, come up here and look at this. This is the eye candy book, which must have cost about $80 a book to produce. The curious thing about this is that Kenneth Carley wrote the text in 1961. So really all that they did in Minnesota was the Historical Society took the 1961 text and then they updated it with all these 21st century. They put in things like excerpts from letters home and things like that. And the Military Journal magazine gave that one a 5-star rating. But again, there's nothing at all, not even the Sioux conflict is mentioned in there. So, and the Texas book, which is in the center with the stars and bars, this is clearly the most 21st century book. It's written by college professors. I'm not sure that the general readers in Texas will like it, but it's fun to look at. It's one of those books where a panel of college professors get together and they identify topics that need further research, and then they assign the topics to other college professors, and you get, by the end, you get 17 contributors. Some of the topics, just to give you some flavor here, the point is that historiography is an ongoing process. That's what hits you over the head with the Texas book, is that 50 years from now, when there's a 200th anniversary of the Civil War, that they might produce the same type of book, only with different topics. Hopefully some of these topics will have been resolved by then. Okay, so we've got, am I still on? Okay. So the Minnesota book here, very different styles. The old text with a military focus combined with modern graphics, but no social history analysis. The Wisconsin book is a hybrid book, I would call it. There's some local politics, some military history, but it doesn't really include what you would expect in a 21st century book. For example, women, there is about a page about African-American soldiers in Wisconsin. I read it last night. There's like 353 African-Americans that fought in the 20th U.S. Colored Infantry Regiment from Wisconsin. The Texas book is the one where you clearly get an emphasis on social history and developing the national historiography as being of prime importance. And then the Connecticut book has some social history mixed in with the traditional military analysis and politics. I enjoyed the Connecticut book, if any of you are interested. So, the trend seems to be, this is my final slide, the trend seems to be that we're moving beyond popular history toward a more multi-dimensional historical model. The movement seems to be going slowly, however. I think it's in part due to concerns about readership. How many people are going to buy the book? There's an interesting quote in the jacket of the Wisconsin book. This was not written by Professor Clement. This was written by some marketer, I'm sure, from the Wisconsin Historical Society, where it says, "This long-awaited study will appeal to students, researchers, and Civil War buffs no less than to the general reader." So there's their marketing strategy. At least they're honest, I guess. So that's the challenge. Now, I'll leave it to you all to decide for yourself if you think that I've been able to achieve that balance. But whatever you do decide, I would, if you're interested at all, whether it's social history or military history or women's history, look at the Civil War. There's just a lot of exciting things that are going on in the books that are being issued these days. So now it's time for questions. Well, I hit the 45-minute, right? Okay. Yes.
I was curious, you mentioned in your map of the families you followed, everyone's origin except Alex Clark. Do you know where he was born?
Alex Clark was,
Could you repeat the question?
oh sure, thank you. Your question about where Alex Clark was born, Alex is the only African American in the group of 6 families. He was born, his parents were slaves in Pennsylvania, and somehow when he was young, Alex wound up in the town of Cincinnati. And when he was 17, this is sort of legendary around the town of Muscatine still. Alex got on a boat from Cincinnati, wound up in Muscatine in 1842, and spent the rest of his life in Muscatine. So he was actually an old-timer by the time of the Civil War. His wife was an escaped slave from Virginia. I'm not sure where they met. He wasn't with her when he left Cincinnati, so my guess is that she may have migrated to Ohio or Pennsylvania someplace. And how she got to Iowa, I don't know. They had 2 children. Next question. Right. Well, great question, and to repeat it, how do we count people by religious denomination in the pool of volunteers? And it's not easy. I can't say for certain. It's mainly, my conclusion is based on anecdotal information. But there was a lot of anecdotal information about, I mean, first of all, you look at the diaries and letters home that survive. What you get is Methodists, New School Presbyterians, missionary Baptists, for example. Many of them attended church services in the Army. There's also some information too, and first of all, the class of 1862 was, most of the men came from southern Iowa, about so in other words, the European natives did not volunteer in large numbers in 1862. So you're talking about the people who were filling the ranks were generally people who were born in the United States, and the frontier denominations were well represented in Iowa. Oh, Disciples of Christ. I didn't mention Disciples of Christ. So we've got Baptist, Methodist, Disciples of Christ, Presbyterian. There's one that I'm missing. I apologize to anybody. He just said Lutheran, and I said, well, now we're going to get into an argument about German. So, yeah, of course, the Lutheran church in Germany is called the Evangelische. So, no, I don't consider Lutherans in 1861 to be of the same stripe as the Methodists. That's nothing negative there about Lutherans. My grandmother was a Lutheran. So, other questions, Marv?
One of the most common claims you see about Iowa's role in the Civil War is that it contributed more soldiers per capita than any other state. Since you've looked at Iowa and other states, would you address that issue?
Well, I've read a lot of books that say our state contributed more per capita, and I don't even know that the math is really complicated. There's also all the statistics about how many soldiers fought, and that's usually the historians pick the high number. But the problem is that you're counting people who enlisted in a 90-day regiment and then re-enlisted in another regiment, so they get counted twice. Okay, there were some considerable number of soldiers who were discharged from disability before the 3-year service term was up, and they get counted twice if they re-enrolled in like a 100-day regiment. And then the veterans, in other words, the people that volunteered for 3-year service in 1861, who could have gone home in 1864, who chose to re-enlist, they get counted twice too. So, to my way of thinking, if you're really going to count that, you need to take a more scientific approach and not allow your pride to infect how you do the calculation. What I think is important isn't the number of people who fought, but how were they selected? I was very impressed by what Governor Kirkwood did and the Adjutant General Nathaniel Baker, no relation to me. Nathaniel Baker was a lawyer in Clinton, educated at Harvard Law School, he was picked by Kirkwood early in the war to be the adjutant general of the whole state, and he served as the adjutant through the whole war. Nathaniel Baker was a Democrat who became a Republican, like many war Democrats during the war. But they understood that quality of recruits was important. So when 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds were showing up to volunteer for a 3-year service, Kirkwood and Baker and some of the other administrators would say, no, you're too young, lad. We're not going to take you. They did that because they knew they wouldn't last very long. They were going to get homesick pretty quickly. So and of course, the local county was trying to say, let's count this guy. Maybe he's really 18, and they said, no, he's not old enough. And so what they wanted to do was not only meet their federal quotas, but they wanted to have solid, in other words, they wanted to minimize the amount of erosion that was going to happen. I mean, erosion happened with every regiment, but if you include people who were very young, the frequency of erosion is going to increase. The other thing that they did, which was tremendous, in 1862, the federal government gave states the option to form 9-month units or 3-year units, okay? And there were some of you who know the Battle of Gettysburg. There was an important role played at the Battle of Gettysburg by a 9-month regiment from Vermont, who were right there when Pickett's men were charging toward the cemetery. But after the Gettysburg battle was over, the 9-month period was gone. So the Vermont soldiers went back to Vermont. Kirkwood and Baker did not like the idea at all of 9-month recruits. They thought it was much better to have 3-year units. So every Iowa unit, for the most part, was a 3-year unit. We did not have any 9-month units. The other advantage too is that to meet your quota, if you formed a 9-month unit, you only got credit for 1/4 of what you did if you formed a 3-year unit. Okay, so. In other words, it was to Iowa's advantage to form 3-year units because we would reach our quota limit sooner, and in part because of that, Iowa managed to avoid having to do a draft until very late in the war. Iowa only had one draft, and that was to fill 1,900 spots. So whereas in Wisconsin you've got draft riots in 1862, Iowa produced over 20 3-year units that same year, and there were no draft riots. And they all served through the end of the war. So, sorry, I'm kind of digressing from your question, but I think that I'm not sure how much value there really is in trying to calculate the per capita.
A question about drafts. Were they simply totally up to the states rather than federal?
Yes. The question is, who's responsible for conscripting people? The only thing the federal government did was say you've got to produce this many new soldiers. So they didn't really care whether you drafted them or not.
That was state by state.
It was state by state. So Connecticut did a draft, and Matthew does a great job of explaining how the Connecticut units that were conscripted really were lousy units. And not surprisingly, if I had been, so there were also problems with Missouri units that were conscripted. There was one famous story that there was the 40th Missouri Infantry Unit was made up of conscripts. They were called the 40th Missouri. And I was just, the book on New York City is also good when it was published a couple years ago. And New York City, of course, not only did they have draft riots, but they had tremendous trouble filling the needed spots, meeting the quota, in other words. And the men that they did press into the Army really didn't help the cause of the Union very much. A lot of them deserted and then re-enrolled in New York City in a different unit, or went to another state to re-enroll, get the bounty, and then desert. So, yes.
I thought your your discussion of how a state delineated approach can jibe real well with the ambitions of social history. Is your that nexus? Do you carry that through explicitly in your book, or is that a subject for a separate article later, say?
Do I carry through the social history?
How those two are connected, and maybe one hand washes the other a little bit.
Right. To try and achieve that, I started with the Panic of 1857. So for each of these 6 families and 6 communities, what I did was look to see, using for example, the agricultural census data to see what did their farm look like. Was it a subsistence farm? Was it a farm where they could actually sell some excess produce? And so I started with that, and then when you get to chapter 3, then there's Fort Sumter. So I've sort of set the background to these families, and then we look to see at what point the bachelors in these families enrolled in the Army. And then so I go back and forth between home front and the military front. And it is a challenge to write, and I'm not sure if everybody will find it pleasing reading. I hope they do, but it is a challenge to integrate various threads together. Somebody else has a question, I think. Yes.
You mentioned about Wisconsin having so many, is it European immigrants?
Yes.
Much more so than, is there a reason behind that? Identified?
I didn't find that in the book. I'm sorry, I don't know much about Wisconsin. Maybe somebody here knows more than I do. But the one thing I do know is that early on, Wisconsin allowed immigrants to vote without becoming citizens. So if you were male, if you were 21, it didn't matter where you were born, you could vote. So aliens voted. So as you can imagine, that attracted a large number of people looking for a fresh start. And oh, I'm sorry.
You mentioned that the Iowa troops were basically in Missouri and Arkansas. Is there a reason for that? Because I know Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois troops were all in the Eastern campaign later on.
Right. That's a good point. The question is, why were Iowans so heavily concentrated in the Trans-Mississippi and not in places like Virginia? And there was one Minnesota unit in the Army of the Potomac for the entire war. There were, I think, 4 Wisconsin units in the Army of the Potomac. The Iron Brigade was made up of three of the 5 regiments in the Iron Brigade were made up from Wisconsin. I did find the answer to that at that point in the war, when there was a sense that Washington was surrounded by Confederates, Congress panicked, the executive branch panicked, and they asked for every unit that was available to come to Washington. So that's how the Wisconsin troops got to Washington as early as they did, and that's how the Minnesota. Now the Minnesota regiment, there's a book out on the first Minnesota regiment. They were a 90-day regiment, like other 90-day regiments, but they were in Washington, and again in that sort of panicked environment. The governor of Minnesota declared that the 1st Minnesota was now a 3-year regiment. So the case actually went to court. The soldiers in the 1st Minnesota regiment actually sued in district court in Washington, D.C. for permission to go back home because our 90 days were up. Well, the judge, again, was one of the people who was worried about the White House being taken by Confederates, and he tossed the lawsuit out. So nevertheless, it was a very heroic regiment. By the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, there was hardly anybody left in the regiment. They had so many battle casualties. But there were no riots by the 1st Minnesota Regiment, which is surprising.
Let's thank Tom for his...
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.